Hi, everybody. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for being here. My name is Danilo Machado. I'm a producer of public programs here at Brooklyn Museum. And we're so excited to be presenting the fourth in our second Sunday series inspired by Virgil Abloh's social sculpture, in which we are sitting here today. And the social sculpture was conceived of by Virgil as a museum within the museum, a sort of Trojan horse where folks would gather and learn from each other and learn from folks in all different kinds of artistic practices. So in that spirit, we've been hosting monthly conversations, lectures, experiences in the social sculpture and in the auditorium, inspired by Virgil's creative network. And today we're thinking about the theme of architecture with Oana Stănescu, who is a Roman architect who is currently building in North America and Europe. Her studio's work is an undisciplined collection of projects across scales, programs, and collaborators, always in the pursuit of affect of physical space. She's based in New York and Berlin, and current projects under construction include a reconvention of a half-kilometer-long bridge in Romania, a very long house in Canada, and an attic in the south of France. She is teaching at Harvard GSD and MIT in Cambridge. Please welcome Oana.
Thank you. You can. Hi, everyone. I wish I was Roman. I'm just Romanian, I'm afraid, though. All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I know it's a Sunday, so let me see. Yeah, I'm soft-spoken. I just got shit for it the other day. All right. So this is not the entire slide because it's cropped. Wow, way to give it away. Yeah, sorry. Sweet. And can I have the... So does it work now, or?
Collection of PDFs. It's actually not PowerPoint, so
So it doesn't work anyway with the remote. Okay, cool. So I just have to stand there and okay. It's okay. All right. I mean, I could just plug in my computer and maybe it works better. Okay, let's just start or something. It's super weird to be here, and one of the strangest positions to be in. So I was swearing a lot at Virgil in my mind this past 6 months, pretty much, because what are you what are you gonna do? It's weird to be so naked in grief in front of a public, right? And in a way, I was having so many conversations with him. Y'all are here to see Virgil. I'm here to see Virgil. In a way, scary. That's him. But so it was all back and forth of how to do him justice, how to do our work, our collaboration, and everything justice. So in a way, I still have so many conversations with him. So I basically try to keep his voice here. So mostly what you're gonna see is text message exchanges and him just his voice being present, which I felt was quite necessary for me at least. Okay, so. They said I should talk about architecture, so I'm trying to start there, and really where I want to pick it up is where Jim, Joe, and Bafik left it a couple of weeks ago. So they have this whole thing with the generalist versus specialist. It's also something that Virgil talked about a lot. And one thing that I think is very important to be understood is that Virgil is seen and understood as an architect, because that's what he was. And I want to just explain briefly why that's the case. I'm not sure about everyone's background, but you know, I always think of design essentially, or of architecture. It's a little bit like design on steroids. It's one of the most complex forms of design, just because of the sheer complexity of it all, right? And as an architect, you're taught a little bit as a generalist, not a specialist. You're kind of okay at many things, you're not great at a single thing. And that's where the beauty of it lies too. And when I say the complexity of it, you know, building depends on policy, on law, on the environment, on the weather. on many people, engineers, consultants, collaborators. It's like, it's a pain in the ass, to be honest. It's like very complex and not an easy thing. So on the one hand, you have the complexity. On the other hand, you have the reality of the fact that you can't work on a one-to-one basis, meaning in design, before we had these shoes on or the phones or whatever, there were thousands of mock-ups being done that they looked at and tried on and made changes. You can't do a building and be like, I'm gonna move this window to the right and, you know, make this 3 stories taller. So you kind of are working with a little bit of an unknown there, and with it's a bit of a muscle that you have to train with, trying to anticipate space. It's very hard to imagine space, even as an architect. I think it's not so much about making that leap, you just kind of accept that you can't do that. So that's all to say that, and I felt ultimately, to me, what the architect means is you have a skill set that allows you to look at a very complex issue in the face and sort of trust the process that you're gonna come out of it for the better, in a way, that you pick a concept on day one and say, you know, this is what I want this to be about, and you're working your way through the 100,000 issues that go from let's say the environment to the front door to installation to the toilet paper holder or the doorknob, and you have to have patience for years kind of working your way through it. So just thinking of Virgil through that prism, that's exactly what he did. He did take people from all sorts of different fields and threw them all together in and worked at a really kind of complex high level place. And then, you know, how does that happen? How do you work through that complexity of the issue is, sorry. So this again comes back to Virgil and this notion, I'm not even sure what slides I still had here, but I'm just gonna do this thing of just running through some of them. But I mean, maybe I should have started with a little bit of context. Virgil and I go all the way back for like about 10 years. We worked on many different projects, did the first Off-White stores, but we have a lot of history, including doing the Harvard GSD lecture together, a book, and so on and so forth, but also being each other's soundboards. And I mean, the first, you know, when this exhibition opened at the MCA, Teddy, sorry, for the love of me, I can't work this. Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. So the first, you know, when this exhibition opened at the MCA, I was asked to write a text for the book, and I didn't have time, and anyway, just thought of also Virgil and our history, and I ended up just giving them this screenshot, because this is the perfect encapsulation of my relationship with Virgil. We're just there for each other and to exchange ideas, and to sort of constantly just see what the other one is doing and really just use each other's brain to that end. This is a screenshot that he sent me. So he had texted that to someone and then sent it to me. He was so amazing in just kind of always uplifting you and supporting you. And it was a bit of a push from the back. I think for many of us who you're going to see on the stages on the Second Sunday series, it's him pushing us from the back to kind of keep doing the work that in many ways he started. And of course, a lot of it was fun, and that's him saying he hated 99% of fashion, and he was similar with how I feel about architecture, but that ultimately it's still maybe part of the reason why we're operating in this field. So I had mentioned the complexity of the issue. You know, the whole kind of quotation marks and the question everything is something that I think about a lot, because to me that's the essence or the fundament of any design project or process. You start by questioning something. The quotation marks, we're doing that already, right? Any single word put into it, you're like, is he saying this or that, or he's messing with us, right? But then in essence, that's what design also does. You take the notion of, let's say, a shoe, and you ask yourself, what is a shoe? What does it need to do? What's a seam? What's a logo? What are any of the things? And how much do I want to you know, just reinvent those things or not? And but the other thing of the questioning everything, of course, it's like questioning institutions, questioning the product, questioning the brief, but questioning the context. But the other thing that I find quite interesting and important is you have to question yourself. Not as in doubting yourself, but you have to understand your own intuition, right? Our brains are kind of weird, and every single intuitive decision that we take has 100,000 implications. So then how do you really understand what's important to you in that and what's not? So this sort of form of self-interrogation is to me as important as the notion of questioning everything around it. Questioning the familiar is the single most important part, because the foreign we know how to, we question to begin with, but the familiar one risks to become almost too familiar, so to speak. So that's all to say that I think, to me, design process is very much a very vulnerable place. You need to be able to feel comfortable enough to say stupid or silly things, and you need to be comfortable to work with the unknown, accepting that you don't know and actually discover new things. I always say, we did a small workshop earlier, and I also said that, my first boss always used to say, if you know from the beginning what you're doing, you've done it before. So really, in order to uncover something new, you really have to accept this notion of not knowing and discovering things together. And I'll make a small detour by talking a project that we did recently with Virgil that very few people know about, but it's actually quite important for me that people hear about it. And it really started in a typical Virgil fashion, with actually, sorry, we'll come back, we'll return. Completely wrong order of things. It actually started in May 2020, if you remember that year, a bit of a strange year. Let's say first month of the pandemic. So we just had different exchanges, and he's like, okay, let's just do something. And he posted that conversation, and he said, Oana and I are down to do a Zoom with political science programs to kick around some ideas. I was like, oh God. I operate at a slightly different level. It was like, I wonder what comes of it. But then Nora reached out, and she's a lawyer who works for the Stanford Legal Design Lab. And then we basically set up a couple of courses. First, we did a seminar at Harvard GSD, and then we set up a studio within MIT that's called Blueprints of Justice. And we've been working ever since. The work continues. It's a 3-year program, so we looked at social justice the first year, particularly courthouses. We looked at abortion clinics and human rights this year in spring, and we're looking at environmental justice next semester. And this has been incredible work and super interesting. And it ties to what I was saying earlier. We go in blind. So the classroom are very horizontal. We go in and find people to talk to. In the cases of the courthouses, lawyers, of course, lawyers, judges, so on and so forth, but also people that had to deal with the system, people who go about it differently, who try to do forms of restorative justice, and so on and so forth. And we try to learn about the issue, do the brief together with the students. Everyone defines their brief and what it is that they want to intervene on and design, and then ultimately a design. And one thing that became very interesting to us is, by juxtaposing architecture students with law students, I feel they see their worth a little bit more because they're surrounded by people with different skill sets. And then they kind of understand what they have to bring to the table. But the fundamental difference between the studios that was very interesting is at courthouses, everyone was able to understand architecture is complicit in the bigger problems, in the bigger issue, right? And everyone was sort of was building up that anger, that very healthy anger of like how messed up things are. But when it came to the time to actually propose something or be part of the conversation, everything went a little bit down because everyone felt like, how can you even address such issues, or like how can you participate in this? And this was very interesting and telling to me because our counterside, Nora, the lawyer, she said, what's up with you guys? Why do you guys think you could solve social justice? Like, what's wrong with you guys? We lawyers don't think we can solve it. And this was a very telling moment because I think we as architects are trained to kind of walk in and ride on our white horse and save the day, and you make a beautiful buildings and then the world is perfect all of a sudden. But that's not the reality of it. And it's a very humbling experience, but when you understand that architecture is just like one small part of a larger conversation, you can really just embrace that and make that better, as opposed to try to over-aim, overachieve, or kind of miss the very point of what architecture can do. In the case of and what architecture can do, I can point towards two different things. What was interesting in the case of the courthouses, most projects and students proposed visions. And this was something that was required, in a way demanded or asked for, of us also by the people we were talking with. Meaning they proposed buildings or spaces that would paint towards what the system, what the justice system could or should be looking like. Meaning, in very direct terms, it was almost never just a courthouse, but it was spaces that could also hold court proceedings, but they were part of a wider social network, out of a space that also would offer mental health services and childcare and form different kind of community spaces where community could have their own proceedings and for spaces for forms of restorative justice. So it wasn't so much saying, in a way, I think it felt very much like, okay, let's propose, let's show what this could be, and let's try to walk towards that. In the case of the human rights issue on abortion clinics, the opposite happened. The reality of it, I think, was also so real and immediate, and you realize doesn't have anything to do with anything. So they really zeroed in just on the reality of a space, and how can you create a space that can feel safe, that can feel dignified, that can feel respectful in someone trying to really access their basic freaking human right. And so it became very much about the architecture of care and like the really just how a space can provide those sort of quality of spaces. And I want to use here just briefly a quote from Bell Hooks, because we anchored our work so much in it, and it kind of maybe explains a little bit what we're trying to do with all of this, which is, she says, to be truly visionary, we have to root our imagination in our concrete reality, while simultaneously imagining possibilities beyond that reality. And that's how we approach that thing. And in a way, for me, this is very important because I don't know how many fashion designers running some of the largest, fashion houses in the world can add this to their CV. And this work would not have happened had it not been for Virgil and had he not put that out. And he was an active part of the class and worked closely with us till the very end, and which I'm very grateful of. And I think that speaks, these are just sort of the text message exchanges during Zoom, where we couldn't believe how quickly we were able to pull it off, and how awesome it was, and how rewarding too. And architecture is, for better or worse, I think about it a lot, but it's for better or worse what I ended up doing completely by chance, by mistake. It's what I've been doing, what I kind of know how to do. And I think everyone has sort of different things. But for me, the big sort of why I got stuck there was really the first project, which was the first in school, which was the realization that you can take something from deep inside you and let live outside. I had mentioned it also earlier in the workshop. In our case, we just had to draw the space that we were living in, so like a bedroom, learn how to draw, how to dimension, and then turn a space into a place. And I think that's always a very powerful and beautiful way of thinking of architecture as you walk through the city, as you experience any architecture, just asking yourself always, what makes a space, what makes a place, what is the difference, and how can you define it? And in my case, what I did at the time, I, of course, in my emo fashion, turned it into a space of isolation. I apologize, this was before pandemics, we weren't isolating yet. So in a way, I made my little cocoon. But it was the first time where I was 18 at the time, and it was the first time when I was able to take, something that I was just feeling and had no words for, and kind of let it live outside of it. And, I was thinking of that as I rewatched Virgil's lecture, which is playing in the background. maybe that's what we all want to watch right now too. But I was rewatching it, and I hadn't watched it since we did it in 2017, I think. And one thing that stood out to me, he says so often, I actually wrote down the words because I don't want to mess him up, but he says so much, find your DNA, what's the personal thing, what's the human thing, what are you emotionally tied to, do the project that you believe in. And then he says, most of these hurdles are self-imposed. Like that's one of the things that really stuck out to me so much, because he really was trying to point towards, there's many factors on the outside that we have zero control on, but there's the things that we have control is what happens on the inside. And when he mentioned the point with, most of these hurdles are self-imposed, he also says, designers didn't look like us. The designers didn't look like me. And he says that and then points towards the inner hurdles. And it's something that I keep coming back to a lot, because I think that place of creation, that sort of where things come from ultimately, they come from that place that we typically try to hide from ourselves, quite often from others. It's the thing that makes us weird, it's the thing that makes us awkward, it's the thing that keeps us from fitting in. But that's in a way all there is, and that's all we are. And the reason I'm posting some of these messages from him is because the only way to really mine that source is by surrounding yourself with people that allow you to be awkward, that allow you to be weird, that allow you to celebrate all of that. And that's what Virgil did for so many of us, and just kind of pushing from behind and just really making sure that, yeah, we could be that and we could do that. And I'm trying to also do all the homework that he left me with. Thank you, Virgil. So, there you go. So he posted this in, I guess, 1st of March 2020. Very strange to revisit, but you can't quite see it on the screen, but it says here, this work you have to ask Oana about in 30 years. I added another 20. I said, don't add me till 2050, but I guess we're unfortunately a little bit sooner here. And you know, what happened with that anvil was, maybe actually before the anvil, I swear these are in a very weird order. So I'm gonna try to freestyle. Actually, let's just leave it there. Basically, I had been through something similar a few years before. So when he got the diagnosis, we became close through it. Unfortunately, me experiencing it, fortunately, me having experience allowed me to be for other people there going through something similar. So he always said, you know, I'm feeling actually physically fine, but there's an anvil over my head. So then we just started messing with it and just kind of texting around, and we were also on the phone and just talking about what can you do with that anvil, and how can you take ownership, and can you blow it up, and can you put glitter on it, and can you make it light or make it out of glass, or let it break, or so on and so forth. And I actually had no idea, you know, make it pick foam or so on and so forth. And I did what I know how to do best, which is make models or drawings, and I made a little blue foam anvil and sent it to him. And it seemed like we had the same eye for proportions. It's the biggest compliment you can get. And then before we know it, that the anvil became, you know, a sculpture in a museum. I had no idea. Actually, he had sent me this, and I was like, wow, that was fast. And but the other thing that I want to point out towards was also that, you know, then COVID came. And we were laughing because we said that anvil was not hanging above the world. Because those first weeks, if you remember, it was like full of uncertainty. You don't know, am I doing something a month from now or not? Are people still getting married? Am I still traveling to where? Where does it happen? And that's very similar with getting a diagnosis like that, which is full of uncertainty and full of just many, 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 many unknowns. You know, the reason I bring this up also with surrounding yourself with people, I feel we can talk a lot about the work and we can look at it in details and so on and so forth, but one of the things that that really, how should I put it? It's a little thought experiment, so bear with me. Basically, it's sort of understanding the influence we have on one another. And the little thought experiment that you have to hopefully indulge me in is basically a few years ago, there were in the last 1 to 2 decades, there were a lot of just medical and scientific advances, which are really powerful from many perspectives, and they will affect our lives in ways in which we don't fully understand yet. But one of these studies, basically what they realized was that they were able to study how if you put 2 bodies in one room, oftentimes the heart starts beating in sync. Sometimes the breathing starts adjusting to each other too. So what the brain normally does 90% of the time, I only half understand this, by the way. So what it does is just trying to keep us alive and sort of constantly regulating all energy levels, right? So when it's in the presence of another body, those bodies are in synchrony and they adjust their energy level to one another. somewhat creepy. Some of that is happening right now, but that's the reality of how our physical bodies work. And what blew my mind to me when I read about it is understanding that I feel up until that moment, I thought that my body was autonomous, that I end here at the outer level of the skin. But understanding that the sheer presence of someone else, and sometimes it's a presence and sometimes it's just words, really goes way past the skin and deeper the skin, was really a beautiful way of thinking of me, of friendships. And this was very much tied to the pandemic too, and conversations with Virgil or with Ryan or with Jim Joe or with Jack or with other people that we would just, at one point I couldn't tell where where does an idea begin or end? Did it come from me? Did it come from a book? Did someone put a word out there? And sort of it all became so blurry. And then realizing this, actually there is a blur between all of us. So if we think of ourselves like as each other's weather, maybe, like the impact that we can have, the way we go, not under each other's skin, but the fact that there is something that's between all of us, that it's kind of a push and pull, a bit of an ocean, a bit of a water, that is alive and real, then it's all there, it's really what we're bringing into a room. That's an incredible, powerful way for me to make sense of the world, but also to make sense of Virgil. Because we can talk a lot about the products and the sales and the objects and so on and so forth, but to me it was very much about the spirit. And I mean, honestly, it's just a lonely place to not have him around, because he's a conversation partner, and that basically once you lose the conversation partner, you lose part of yourself. And that sense of someone being so awesome of a human being and just such an amazing friend and pushing so many of us from behind, generous and so on and so forth, is just incredible and detouring. But I think that's an important side of it that's oftentimes underestimated. We're not thinking, we're not trained, we're not having the conversations that lead to appreciating just someone's spirit and someone being an awesome person and someone being generous. And I think those are ultimately the biggest takeaways and the biggest lessons we can get from someone like Virgil. And so towards the end, and then I hope we can have a further conversation and open it to Q&A and so on and so forth. What's the best way of doing this? I'm trying to think. Okay, so one of the last things he had asked me, or not so last things, on that note, this was also 5 years ago, which is also very strange, and part of the homework. When I got sick and I let him know I couldn't join his first lecture that I think he had done, which was at Columbia, and I told him why. I mean, we were working on projects together too. And this was his response to me. And again, it's just something that maybe it's too intimate, but I share freely because it's a side of him that is very important to me. And I would also share with him while he was going through it. If, in case you were wondering about the title page, again, it was homework. That's him saying this will be the opening slide of some future lecture. So it felt fitting. And it's all, this is a year ago, almost to the date, I promise you. And one of the things that he said that was extremely profound in the midst of all of this, he said, what a crash course in loving this test deals us. And I kind of feel this is part of that homework too that he left behind. Like, this was to me incredibly deep, but also what it means for me is really whenever you go through these quintessential moments that define you, who you are through something tough, it really comes down to that. And to me this, the loving, it's in a way that is the homework, because love, like we were talking about questioning everything, I think it's one of those fundamental words that is in the air, in the aether, that we orient ourselves, guide our lives around, but we rarely question it or really interpret what it means. So I think when, for me what this meant is when he says the crash course in loving is really defining what that means for each and every one of us. It's not Bell Hook's version of love, it's not Whitney Houston's version of love, it can't be anyone else's version of love. It needs to come from deep inside, just like everything else. Sorry if you thought you were gonna get architecture. But I'll end it with this. So one homework that he gave me at one point, he had asked probably many of his collaborators to do a video on free game. And to put it, I guess, on a website or resource thing, there's always a plan. Virgil asks for something, you do it, and like no question. So I was trying to write through it, and I was like, I don't have a game, whatever. It's like, it was a weird, I couldn't quite get into it. But also in working with law students as part of Blueprints, what we realized is they kept asking as we were designing something, they kept asking, but how did you make this decision? And how did you reach this conclusion? Or how do you do that? And it's very hard to explain, because if you do things, you sometimes just do them and don't know where they're coming from. But I thought maybe at the end, at the end of this, I can just honor that request and kind of talk about a tiny project that he was part of too, and project that, you know, I didn't have social media anymore at this point, so he would post a story, then screenshot it and send it to me to make sure I see it. I mean, so that is the project, and basically it's a stool made out of felt pieces. And they had this sort of little inserts from basically, I'll explain it in a second. So anyway, this was a conversation with him about the project. So I just thought towards the end, I can share the process of this. We have there's two sketches that kind of were done as I was explaining to the students kind of how I was trying to make sense of the project. And so it's a bit of I'll just describe that briefly, and then we can have a conversation around it. So the project was a chair for, I think it's called 909 Archive or something like that, that Virgil did too. So he has his own version of a chair in that exhibition, and you can find it online. And basically the brief, as in any design issue, you always get a brief, right? So the brief said, make a chair for $909, and you have about a month. That's very limited resources. A month is next to nothing, especially if you have a life and are doing things. And $909 is also next to nothing in terms of production and material, right? So what was clear to me, I mean, I like to work within resources, and I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. I was like, okay, this is intense, let's do it, but let's not reinvent the wheel. That was step number one. And then on the other hand, there's two things I think that I was trying to rationalize. Like on the one hand, you have the brief that says chair, and chairs are really difficult to do. Structurally difficult, material difficult, like it's not an easy thing. So I was like, okay, let's reinterpret it as stool. I like stools, they're practical, you move them around, you put books on them, they're a library, you put a plant, practical stuff, easy, doesn't have a lean, structurally way more easy. So making my life easy all the time. And on the other hand, there's all this other stuff that one goes through, right? There's the intuition, there's someone experience, there's a randomness, there's likes and dislikes, like my friends would laugh at this, but for example, I love Dactyl, and I always wanted to do something with Dactyl, and I didn't get there yet. Was the first issue on my mind, went away. But then I was trying to make a bed for my dog, and because I didn't want a dog bed, and made it out of felt. So I started working with felt. And what's interesting with felt, it's one of the oldest materials in the world, because all it is, it's really just kind of wool people used to have in their shoes or as soles, and they just walk in it, and that's what felt is. So I was really into it, and also thinking of it, how ancient it was and everything. But I also like the idea, this was in the pandemic, I thought the really most generous thing you can do is do something by hand, like, or leave somehow a physical trace of you and give that to someone else, in this case as a chair. So I wanted it to feel deeply personal. And then I had this idea of a reading list, but that was fairly vague. So then the reshuffling of the brief based on all of that was like, okay, I'll make a felt stool with some reading materials, basic enough. And that's where sort of chaos to a certain degree ensues, and it's this sort of completely erratic and not necessarily linear process, right? Where I said, okay, felt stool with reading materials. On the one hand, you have the concept, and it's always like, okay, concept means that form of interrogation. How do you think of it? What do you make of it? How do you call it? What's the title? I wanted for a while to call it I Want You to Love Me. I was listening to Fiona's Apple's old album. I don't know if you know it. It's like an amazing song. But it was also the pandemic, and we were all lonely and isolated, or at least some of us. And this notion of that longing for love, and what does it mean when the person or any person can't be next to you? So those were some of the questions where this tool became sort of an offering, a gift that would make a connection that we weren't able to do physically. So it's, on the one hand, it's thinking of those terms. On the other hand, it's like this is just kind of showing a constant back and forth, thinking of the form. Is it something that goes just into a corner? Does it have a different shape? Is it square? Does it have a hole in the middle and you put a vase and there's a tree coming out? Or is there a hard square, like a heart to it, or so on and so forth? Like a lot of back and forth, thinking of boys, looking at precedents. In the end, it became what I had showed you earlier. And it's basically 40 layers of this 1 centimeter thick felt. It's imperfect circles cut by me, and they had this white line on it just so you can orient them and like always put them so they align perfectly. And I ended up calling it feel, felt, 1 to 40 seats for 1 to 80 people. One thing that was important to me in it becoming a stack is that people get to share it. So it's a tall stack. If you split it, do you split it evenly? Do you split it between 3 people? Like, it can become a moving part of a larger conversation. And the feel, felt was a play on the material, of course, but also on what that summer of 2020 meant and how that intensity of those feelings sort of petered down, and a little bit of a hope to still hold on after you experience something deeply intense, where you don't want to completely let it go, but you know you can't live in that intensity, and kind of just thinking of how things sort of, how things go through us and so on and so forth. But the other thing that happened, I mentioned reading materials. So we said, okay, why don't I put inside of that when you share it, like when you open it and like share it with someone, just like putting like Easter eggs, like scans from books of pages that kind of were meaningful to me and that I was into. And so I started putting those together, and then I got really into it and kind of got obsessive about it. And then it became a thing in its own. So if you'll bear with me, and if we still have time, then I'll read through some of that. So that became a bit of a project in its own and had its own life. And it's basically, I'll just, they'll be on the screen. I'll slides through them and also just read them. And you don't need to look at it. You can just listen to it, or your mind might wander, so on and so forth. And we can talk a little bit about it after. I think it speaks to many issues that I was trying to bring up more or less indirectly, definitely to the way my mind works. I think I might just sit here on the ground, actually. Sorry. Okay. So, how do you spend your time, she said. Reading, mostly, I said. I couldn't tell her that mostly I said staring at blank walls or getting stoned into my heart, and then, one day, when I find I could finally masturbate again, making love to myself for hours at a time. The flame was dim and flickering, but it was a welcome relief to the long coldness. Orgasms are kind of like art, I told her. You know it when you see it. It may not be what you expect, but it will be different from everything else. Much of the scientific study of sexuality has been characterized by a deep anxiety about the subjective experiences of sexual pleasure and desire, especially when it's a matter of female pleasure, or prostitutes, orphans, depressive, vagrants, petty criminals, schizophrenics, dyslexics, feminists, rebellious adolescents, anyone in short whose behavior, desires, choices, or appearances fell outside the accepted norm. Feeble-minded women were sent to the Virginia State Colony. When Emma Buck arrived, she was cleaned and bathed, her clothes thrown away, and her genitals douched with mercury to disinfect them. A repeat intelligence test performed by a psychiatrist confirmed the initial diagnosis of a low-grade moron. She was admitted to the colony. She would spend the rest of her lifetime in its confines. But there is really no reason that a woman or women couldn't take any or every role I've already described or will go on to describe for any and every male. That includes the guy joking with his cousin and his cousin's friend, coming down the stairs, genitals exposed, though it does unmitigated violence to the West's traditional concept of women. But I believe it is only by inflicting such violences on the concept that we can prevent actual violence against women's bodies and minds in the political material world. As we have seen, the body was increasingly politicized in this process. It was denaturalized and redefined as the other, the outer limit of social discipline. Thus, the birth of the body also marked its end, as the concept of the body would cease to define a specific organic reality and become instead a political signifier of class relations and of the shifting, continuously redrawn boundaries which these relations produce in the map of human exploitation. Our culture teaches us to focus on personal uniqueness, but at a deeper level, we barely exist as individual organisms. Our brains are built to help us function as members of a tribe. We are part of that tribe even when we are by ourselves, whether listening to music that other people created, watching a basketball game on television, our own muscles tensing as the players run and jump. Most of our energy is devoted to connecting with others. They may not be your relatives. They may never have spoken your language. They may have been dead for 1,000 years. They may be nothing but words printed on paper, ghosts of voices, shadows of minds. But they can guide you home. They are your human community. All of us have to learn how to invent our lives, make them up, imagine them. We need to be taught these skills. We need guides to show us how. Without them, our lives get made up for us by other people. When we are capable of self-awareness, it's usually for very brief periods of time. The window of consciousness during which we can hold a thought or work out a problem tends to be open on average for roughly 7 seconds. What neuroscientists almost never notice, however, is that the great exception to this is when we're talking to someone else. In conversation, we can hold thoughts and reflect on problems, sometimes for hours on end. This is, of course, why so often, even if we're trying to figure something out by ourselves, we imagine arguing with or explaining it to someone else. There's much to say that I don't know how to say. The words are lacking, but I refuse to invent new ones. Those that already exist must say what can be said and what is forbidden. Everything that is known by the mind is an expression and reflection of its own limitation. Most minds forget their own limitations and project them instead onto whatever they know or perceive. This brings us to one of the most challenging ideas. You need an emotion concept in order to experience or perceive the associated emotions. It's a requirement. Without a concept for fear, you cannot experience fear. Without a concept for sadness, you cannot perceive sadness in another person. You could learn the necessary concept, or you could construct it in the moment through conceptual combination. But your brain must be able to make that concept and predict with it. Otherwise, you will be experientially blind to that emotion. Our brains are made so that we can only love a cat as a cat and not as a bird or an elephant. If we want to love a cat, we want to see a cat, touch its fur, hear it purr, and get scratched if we get our petting wrong. We don't want to hear it bark, and if the cat started growing feathers, we would kill, study, and finally exhibit it as a monster. I don't know why our brains are like that, but Kay has taught me that if we try to grow feathers without people expecting us to fly, they will shoot us from the sky, and their dogs will shake us to make sure our necks are broken before we are chucked into a bag and disposed of. Our brains can just about tolerate a cat with a missing tail or 3 legs, but any additions, anything the cat was not supposed to have been born with, will never be accepted. And the cat that barks is a sick cat that spent too much time in the company of dogs. We are often taught that we have no control over our feelings, yet most of us accept that we choose our actions, that intention and will inform what we do. We also accept that our actions have consequences. To think of actions shaping feelings is one way we rid ourselves of conventionally accepted assumptions, such as that parents love their children, or that one simply falls in love without exercising will or choice, that there are such things as crimes of passion. But professionally speaking, you should never trust an artist who does not possess self-doubt. Feeling stuck can stem from a fear of embarrassment, fear of censure of others for trying too hard, for being pretentious, for being blind to one's own positionality, fear of not getting it, of having missed the class in which the right references were handed out, fear of not having any right in the first place. And Lamont imagined an invisible panel of observers, superegos wearing impress me faces, poised ready to trip the writer up. First, there's the vinegar-lipped reader lady who says primly, "Well, that's not very interesting, is it?" And there's the emaciated German male who writes these Orwellian memos detailing your thought crimes. And there are your parents agonizing over your lack of loyalty and discretion. And there's William Burroughs dozing off or shooting up because he finds you as bold and articulate as a houseplant. I would like to address the more interesting part, the accusation that I copy other artists' work and that I claim innovation. Those that make such comparisons do not know the work of these artists and operate at the level of petty gossips. They are not to be taken seriously. It's a pathetically outworn romantic notion that real artists emerge fully formed, having no traceable antecedents. The absurdity of this idea is apparent, and yet there are artists who claim it for themselves. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to answer this vicious and stupid attack. I am furious myself that you will accept only part of that attitude. I want to be alone as much as possible. My opinion is that anything that anyone does is all right, and I refuse to fight for this or that opinion or the country. Don't see any pessimism in my decision. They're only a way towards beatitude. Please understand, I'm trying for a minimum of action gradually. All this is very annoying. The problem, I've said it before, I'm beginning to say it again, is figuring out how to occupy the time you're alive. It's better to occupy it than not to occupy it, as sometimes it can be so captivating that you forget death. This narrow margin, this river, this trickle of water. Life is restricted to life. How can we convince ourselves? It's better to do what I do, right, than not to. It's better to do that than to do nothing. If you can do otherwise, for example, nothing, perhaps it's better to do nothing. But don't think that the importance of what you do can change death's timeline. The sense of death that every being carries within them throughout their lives, cows, horses, men, imbeciles, geniuses, the absolute fear of what is absolutely unacceptable, the absolute disappearance of life. Why this fear, this terror around death? So I think as an artist, so to speak, you have to accept that some part of you is going to die every time you make something that's worth making. That's where your skin is in the game. That's, to me, the choice you make. If you go down this path, you know it's going to take a toll, but you don't always know what the toll is, what it's going to be like. Like me personally, I can't find a partner. That's what's destroying me. I can't find a partner. I have a lot of people in my life, a lot of love in my life, a lot of friends and stuff like that. But I don't have a partner. I don't seem to be able to find a partner, and I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I'm picking the wrong people. I can be bending over backwards. It just seems like I'm a little fearful that that's part of my path, to be solo, which I'm not down with, I'm not happy about. I haven't been able to fully enjoy a lot of my recent success because I don't feel like I have anybody to share it with. I'm happy, I love Gavin, he's great. I love Emily and Lucy, they're great. And I've got so many tight friends, man, but I just don't seem to be able to find a partner. It's wearing on me, man. It's really, really wearing on me. It's the one thing that really disturbs me about the whole thing. Because you could say like, oh yeah, you're an attractive guy, you're having all this success, you should be able to find a woman. But I just don't seem to be able to. It's disturbing as hell. And in my grad school class, as an introduction, we're asked to say what the most important thing is we've done with our lives. Everyone in the class, literally everyone, all 12 people say getting married was the most important thing. I want to say getting out of bed this morning. I want to say doing K with Hazel at a club in Queens last weekend when we locked ourselves in a single-user bathroom and peered at each other through either side of the legs of a chair that was in the corner, curled up on the floor, each of us, saying how much our friendship was a monument, how we helped each other survive, blowing ketamine off of her cell phone, and texting Rovina and telling her to come to the club. R came and we did more K, and we all went back to Hazel's house and talked about the cis girl Hazel is dating, who has only dated guys, and how it feels fucked up to Hazel sometimes, like she's worried that the girl relates to Hazel as a guy or relates to their relationship as a safe rather than a real queer relationship because Hazel has a penis. R got upset and was like, that's wrong, and then Hazel got upset and we all did more K and held each other. I wanted to tell my classmates that that was the most important thing I had done in my life and then walk out of the room. I can't even remember what I actually said, maybe getting arrested at a protest? It took me a long time, a very long time, to begin to realize that she was right and begin to realize what she meant. I, like all of us, thought I knew what I wanted and I thought I knew who I was, and like all of us, I thought that whatever it was I wanted and wherever I wanted to go, I could achieve without paying my dues. For one of the things that one cannot imagine, especially when one is young, is how to pay your dues. You don't even discover that there are any dues to be paid. Later on, one begins to discover, with great pain and very much against one's will, that whatever it is you want, what you want at bottom, must be to become yourself. There is nothing else to want. Whatever one's journey is, one's got to accept the fact that disaster is one of the conditions under which you will make it. The journey, I mean, not make it in an American sense. And you will learn a certain humility because the terms that you have invented, which you think describe and define you, inevitably collide with the facts of life. When this collision occurs, and make no mistake, this is an absolute inevitable collision, when this collision occurs, like two trains meeting head-on in a tunnel, life offers you the choice. It's a very narrow choice of holding on to your definition of yourself, or saying, as the old folks used to say, and as everybody who wants to live has to say, yes, Lord, which is to say, yes to life. That's it. Thank you for bearing with me. I don't have much else, but just to give you a little bit of context to this, so it's just kind of, at the end here you can see it's every single page is from a different book by a different author, so it's like random excerpts that as I started collaging were kind of coming together into something that somewhat made sense to me. I hope it made some sense to some of you. And it, you know, just for the ending, I mean, it's clearly here that it's Baldwin, but there's something that becomes interesting to me also in knowing who reads it and the context and so on and so forth. So the partner aspect, for example, that's a piece from an interview with, it's Arthur J. Fine conversation with Mark Leckey. And you rarely ever hear, right, a successful artist of that stature talk about that intimately, about missing a partner. The introduction, should we pick up? Yeah, I'm sorry. The intro is from Audre Lorde's cancer journals and so on and so forth. So it's really kind of a fairly complex web. There's intense purpose and quite oftentimes different sort of maybe intention behind the writing, but it was just an attempt to collage some of these things together. So all of this to say, I was just trying to give you a little bit of an insight into a really kind of a messy mind, I guess, but also how a project can come together and therefore, yeah. And I'd love to hear from you guys now.
Yeah, if folks have any, thanks, Oana. If folks have questions, I can pass the mic to y'all.
Like my question is like, my name is Gene. My question is essentially like when you're designing something and like crafting it, how important is sharing the notes and like the kind of forming of the concept before I guess the actual piece? Like how important is keeping like I guess the random sketches of ideas and like of concepts? How important is sharing like I guess that like ambiguous nebula before I guess showing the actual like produced product?
I mean, I would never share that. I mean, not that I think one can, but it's just a weird part of the process. I think that's what was admirable about Virgil too. He would always share and make like the design process is weirdly intimate, and it all when you lay it out, it sounds dumb.
Yeah.
Like I did this and then I did that. Like in a way, you know what I mean? Like it's very I think oftentimes quite banal, simple gestures, and I think it makes one vulnerable to share of that. So this was in the context of the class, and I mean, to me, I wasn't sure what I was drawing. I was literally describing it to the students, and I was like, I guess I did this and then this, and it's like messy. And I think there's not much awareness necessarily to a certain degree. So I wouldn't necessarily share them. I also, like for example, this text, Wherever It Will Live, I wouldn't give too much context, and I like the idea that one takes whatever it speaks to them, and the rest kind of falls away, and I'm perfectly happy with that. If you want to dig deeper behind the surface, there's more there, and you can find more. But I think that depends on each. One thing that this made me think of too was Virgil saying there is no aha moment, and I think that's very true. Like in a way, I see, let's say, my process or most processes, like it's this continuous effort of still just trying to take something from inside and allow it to live outside. And the first pass of it is never going to be great, and you're kind of just always trying to close in that gap between what's in your head and soul and what's outside. And it's most of that, I think it's a constant. I don't know that you ever hit it. I think it's a constant sort of trying again and trying again and trying to get better at it. But yeah, so I see it as a more continuous influence and sort of messy process rather than, yeah, I don't know if that answers it.
No, it does. Thank you.
Great notes.
Thank you. Also, thank you for bringing Virgil closer to us. That was really special. I have a question. Well, my name's Diane. I have a question just about how you balance the dialogue of all of the influences that you come into contact with versus the volume of your own thinking, your own ideas. How do you balance that conversation?
That's a good question. I don't know that it is a continuous balance. I do realize that I think I seek a lot of these conversations, which oftentimes just happen on walks or on the phone or whatever, became a big part of my practice. And I think because I worked in many offices across the world, and I realized in those environments quite often, like a simple conversation or the pleasure of someone's company, there isn't room for that in a highly productive environment, right? So kind of, but making room for that, making room for pleasure, for making room for accidents, for serendipity, for people, for that matter, became quite important to me. And sort of I had to learn that. I had to unlearn to be less it's about production and putting things out and allowing things to come in and allowing others to let others in and have the conversation. I mean, I feel quite often with the people that you're able to have that conversation, that again, that sort of ocean between two people, it's not necessarily stable or fixed. And that's why I was like, well, to me, it was really a symptom of the pandemic, of course, because we're all stuck in our heads, where it's like, I generally don't know if this was my idea or it came from whoever, but does it matter? And it has to do, of course, with the ego and so on and so forth too, but I feel once you're able to massage the ego out of, put that to place a little bit too, I'm kind of excited about the room of possibilities that can come from there. And I try not to be naive about it either. Collaboration isn't always easy, it's not always smooth, it's so on and so forth, but sort of, why not live closer to that place? I mean, to me, the thing with the sort of, let's say, with knowing that, okay, our bodies are literally starting to breathe in sync. I mean, if we are to live by that, if it wasn't just facts that lived in a book and, in in scientists' labs and whatever, like that would be such a powerful way of living. And it would be a little bit more mindful with how we treat one another and so on and so forth, right? We need to stop saying so on and so forth. But it's about that, about trying to make room for things, and it's a vulnerable position to be in, but kind of making sure that I ended with this note from Virgil again, because what happens to as you move through life, you accumulate baggage, right? And you go through these existentialist crises, and they catch up with you. So the kind of constant question for me, and I think why I'm interested in conversation, is like, how do you remain open? How do you not let that baggage just accumulate and push you down? And I think that's why we looked always in this conversation to youth and to young people, because there's a freedom in that you just don't, you in a way, right, you're not able to be quite as vulnerable anymore because you already fell on your face. So for me, that's the kind of constant pursuit or question of staying young, quote unquote, like not forget what you know in a way. You know too much, like forget some of what you know and try to relearn it. I'm completely derailing from your question, probably.
No,
Sorry.
this is all really, really valuable. I just have one follow-up in terms of your design process. The period where you're kind of ruminating, letting things bake, and you're having these conversations and connections are starting to form in your own mind versus when you're actually in the act of making. Does that influence change stage to stage, or is it more of a continuum over time?
It's not continuum. For me, production mode is very different than creation mode, but in the production mode, a lot of changes are happening. In the thinking, or like in the conceptualizing mode, it's usually sort of sketching and like nice, like floaty, like easy things. And then production just means headphones on, really loud music, and you kind of just go and you just sort of draw. And of course there's substantial changes that happen in the reality of it. I mean, in architecture too, it's interesting because I'm not sure what field you're in, but you go through so many stages. You have concept and then schematic, and code comes in, and then development, and then there's construction. So there's many different sides to it, and all require different attention or different skill set. And I think that the typical dilemma is when you're pretty far ahead in the project, and you're like, oh, but we could do this, and you're like, are we going back now, or are we going forward? Like there's always that sort of, are we doing it? Like everyone has experienced the deadline, has been there, and knows that pain. And I think that's always a tricky or interesting moment where, of course, self-doubt and so on and so forth come in as like, the usual sort of conundrum of that. But it's anything but linear, I would say.
Much appreciated. Hi, thanks again for literally everything. You posted on stories like a long time ago that you were disappointed at the ratio of kind of like nostalgia. And I wanted to ask if your stance on that has changed, or do you have a new outlook on it, or do you still not like nostalgia in like not only architecture, but just like the era that we're in today in the last, 5 years?
What did I post? No, really, what did it say? Sorry,
you were kind of disappointed in the amount of nostalgia, kind of like purpose in architecture.
Yeah, I mean, don't remember what was, I'm not sure of the context in which or what was in my mind at the time, which is part of the beauty of social media. You can only say so much. But I do think, like, for me, it's always looking forward. And I think we tend to romanticize stories, right? We tend to remind, like, I could have shown you images of projects and tell you how we got there and so on and so forth. And it's always easier to give a squeaky clean version of whatever, of reality in retrospect. And our brains are selective too, and that's how it works. But so for me, it's always just, for me, the exciting moment of any present day is just what's to come. Because everything that you sort of were able to digest, to ingest, to let pass through you by now, it what pushes you forward. There's this quote that at one point existed in this book, which was by Pollock, who said, "Why do we redo things?" And he says, you know, with every artwork that you look at, the intensity grows. So then each artist of new generations just use that intensity and like are reinterpreting and reinterpreting. For me, that was very liberating to, you know, I don't know if I mentioned, I don't think I went to a museum of art till I was like 19 or something like that, which is like literally half of my life, which is kind of super weird to think of, okay, up until then I lived there, and then this happened, like then this door opened to the, let's say, creative world or whatever. And I think to this day I still feel like a toddler where I'm still learning and I'm curious and I'm excited and so on and so forth about everything, no more so on and so forth. And but the question for me always is, and for when that happens, sometimes you think there's nothing you can contribute because you're like, all these great things are already done. Like, what else is necessary? But to understand the agency that each and every one has in their authenticity, in their voice, in their fire, in their soul, and to understand that that's in a way all there is really powerful and liberating too, because then you understand, okay, I have the right, I don't need permission to redo an artwork or to speak to someone or something, or, you know, to paint or in oil or whatever. And sort of just understanding that not only that we have a lot to say and a lot to contribute, but also sort of understanding, like, this moment in time to me is so powerful. Like, it's such a moment of time, of change. And no one, if you ask me, I doubt that anyone really knows what they're, I always think, if anyone is too sure in their footing, I would be wary of them, because like no one really knows what they're doing right now. No one can promise you anything the way they maybe would have been able to 20 years ago. And even then they would have lied, right? So kind of being wary of that and really just kind of understanding this is a power of change. Especially I feel young people, while it's incredibly difficult moment too. It's, I mean, Virgil would always say, it's an incredible moment to be alive. It's a perfect day to be alive. And it's true, like the possibilities are endless. Not just that, but the agency that you have as young people in this moment of time and moment of change. I think for as you get older, it's just harder to accept change, harder to embrace it, you're less malleable. I think when you're young, you just don't have that baggage. So to kind of be able to process in real time this moment of change that is much needed is really powerful. So that's why I don't necessarily have a thing with nostalgia, but I'm always like, it's easy to say things were great 10 years ago, but there's some amazing things right now. So kind of appreciate that, love that as much as you can, because it's gonna go. And then you have again the story where it's like, well, 10 years ago is great. You know what I mean? There's always gonna be another 10 years. So it's always thinking forward, thinking in the now, and sort of what we're creating, as opposed to romanticizing, I don't know, the 70s New York. I mean, I don't know how many of us would have dared to live there. So, you know.
Much appreciated answer.
Thanks. That was great. Thank you so much for this. This kind of relates to Vic's question, but I was curious about Virgil's and or yours relationship to like a capitalist kind of drive behind a lot of the projects and collaborations in your work. I feel I come from a performance background, and I kind of, especially right now, I'm like on this tip about like institutions really having this expectation for performance artists, dance artists to be like really good people with like healers kind of, and like with ideas that are gonna like save us and have like solutions and resolve in their work. And I just feel such a resistance to that. And I wondered, like, yeah, again, in your work or Virgil's, if what that relationship to the kind of, especially because you were, working in design and with clients and things, like what that relationship has been like and how it's kind of panned out in your work.
That's a very good and powerful question. Thank you. And I mean, there's, you mentioned resistance, and I think we bonded over the resistance that we faced in so many environments. And I think you should go in with a sledgehammer, essentially. That's the short of it. But no, I think for me, I don't know if that's the right way of putting it, but because I come from Eastern Europe, I witnessed the revolution early on. There's like a distrust of authority. Like, I can't even do anything against it. I just have a hard time trusting any brand, institutions, or any system and such, you know what I mean? So I think going in sober-eyed and understanding what one can take from a place and leave the rest, take the good, leave the rest, and kind of just do what's necessary for oneself. I think that's always important to go in clear-eyed and sober mind. For me, after my, let's say, journey and dealing with cancer, I knew I wanted to live differently, and I knew I wanted to work differently. And I in a way, what's debilitating about you're working with Virgil, the exposure is kind of insane, right? Like when I had social media, I would disappear for a week, come back, and then all of a sudden, all these things because he had posted something or whatever. And but sort of, I think it's also a very misleading thing. So what I try to do is actually remove myself and give myself permission or allow myself to really just do what I feel like doing and not try to push myself in things that I can't, that aren't mine to begin with. So what it means for my practice is actually working at a smaller scale, and it's more intimate, and you're catering quote unquote to smaller and more intimate crowds or people. But so it's not trying to go for, like, I think the whole number and outreach is very debilitating, but understanding, having one meaningful conversation with one person, being able to have one exchange with one or two or three people is not better or worse than doing it with 100,000 people. And one has to just understand who they are in all of this and what speaks to you and what's of value to you, and then navigate the world accordingly. But I do think for ages it was, for years on end, for me working in offices, it was like I felt that many sides of my personality, of many things inside of me, just didn't have a place to live there, right? So it's like when you try to deny part of you and you're being told, like, you're like, it's also realizing that the moment I realized basically that what I thought was my biggest weakness is actually my strongest asset. At the moment, certain things you can't change about yourselves. And so you can try no matter how much to fit into something. And that's what I meant with, like, that I think that comes from that weird place that we're trying to hide, because it's not easy to live in that place that makes you different unless you're in a world that celebrates that. And this world doesn't exactly celebrate that, right? There's one definition of success that's outside of these doors, and there's one definition of what success means, and so on and so forth. And really, for me, that was crucial understanding, okay, success for me looks quite different than any of these things that I was humbled and honored to see. But for me, I knew I wanted to live in slightly different places, and yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Just a quick question on any early learnings that you had and brought to Harvard or any of the other projects that you've been working on lately.
Is this being recorded? Well, I mean, I think one thing that I always want to say also when I talk about the work, however briefly I mention it, I mean, these aren't endorsements necessarily of any of the schools either, by all means. I think I certainly entered through the back door. When I did my first internship in New York, I applied to some of these schools. I didn't get into any of them, and I think it's one of the best things that happened to me, to be honest, especially in retrospect. I mean, they're amazing places, like there are many other amazing places though too. And so it's interesting to now be teaching in schools like that. But I mean, I'm just grateful for the student body is incredible. It's the architecture departments are fairly international, super mixed, and just like very vibrant places. But there's a clash for sure of perspectives, if I may say so. So I studied in Romania. It was like free public education, and I don't know what it means to grow up in a country in which you're being told you have to, like, this is what success is, like going to any of these schools. Like, this is an insane pressure, and not to even say of, like, the implications of that. Arthur Jafa always used to say that Ivy League schools are real estate companies with fancy names. But there's a lot to that. But I am grateful for these places, and in a way with Virgil, I was just telling Danilo earlier, the lecture that we did at the GSD. I mean, I had invited him to speak to my class, and then he posted it on Instagram, and high schoolers from the neighborhood called the class up and the school up, and they asked, is he giving a lecture? Is this open to public? Can we join? How often do you have high schoolers call like some even worse private institution? And it's pretty amazing. And I'm only saying that because I feel these schools are amazing places, but anything that just lives in a bubble is gonna sort of default at one point. Sort of. So for me, this intersection of the different worlds and having to being able to have high school kids come into a lecture and sit in the same room with any of those professors and students was super important. And it seems obvious in a way that some of that needs to happen. I probably don't address your question directly. In terms of education, what's in Romania, we were told you're only ever going to build brick buildings, therefore you need to know how to build brick buildings. I've never still built a brick building, but it was a very pragmatic education, because they feel the responsibility, like people just need jobs, like you don't have time to talk, basically. And here the education is on the far other spectrum. So one thing that we try to do, and traditionally the path in architecture is you study and then you go work for someone for ages, and then by the time you have white hair, like that's the official qualifier for an architect, right? It's like literally in the Matrix. So white guy, white hair, white suit, everything. So I mean, it's the reality. If you look at it, it's a brutal profession, unfortunately. But you halfway through you realize you're like, okay, how? And I think architecture is still being taught a lot that way. And it's at the conundrum where it needs to catch up with the times, because I think people have a hard time reconciling who they are, what they care about, with what they're being taught about architecture. And so we try to, we said with Blueprints, we're trying to bring the streets closer to the school. Like in a way, we also did something at the AA in London. It was all about bringing real life, real people, real problems, real issues in the school, and allow like trust the students as opposed to teach in a patronizing way. I think you have to understand that it's not about skill set, like learning a software, learning to render, learning to whatever. All those things anyone really puts their mind to will master them. And yes, some great people are going to be exceptional and others not. But it's not about that. The main thing that I see in terms of, I mean, I see myself more as an instigator and Alice is there, so she can see how she was part of the Blueprint Studio. She can confirm or deny it. But I feel it's really about being there, allowing someone to make their first mistakes and learning to walk on their own. And the moment that happens, I can step away. Like the moment you're able to become your own teacher, you don't need anyone anymore. So it's more so about demystifying the process and really just sort of, just enabling people to follow their kind of what Virgil was doing too, right? Just pushing from behind and sort of, what do you care about? Who are you? And all of this, so on and so forth. I don't know if it's.
Okay, any final question? Yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for your talk. It was very inspiring. So I'm wondering, I'm currently a student, an undergrad student doing film studies, and there are a lot of ideas and philosophies and just like eye-opening illumination of the education that you're talking about. Like, someone like great minds are pushing us from behind, and we're propelled to go forward to like think differently and ask different questions. But I'm also wondering, because I'm still a student, and like any life post student is kind of like in the mist to me. I don't know what's gonna come to me later on after this 4-year plan. I'm also on the F1 visa, so like I have a purpose of staying here, if that makes sense. So I was wondering, like, as an artist, as someone who has already stepped out from that structure, how does it feel? Like, I don't know. Might not be a very specific question, but it's just that how is the world like after you get out of a structure?
It just gets worse.
Oh no.
I don't know, sorry. I mean, it's only half true, I guess, to a certain degree. I mean, it gets worse and it gets better in the same time, right? But I mean, I remember when I was a student, people telling me, you're so free now, you have no idea. And I was like, whatever. And now I'm like, yeah, I was so free. I mean, I think it's just hard to see what one has if that's all they know, right? But one thing that I realized is, as long as you're still in school or those early years, the milestones are pretty clear, right? That you're trying to graduate, you want to take some classes, like where you're going is clear. And then in the beginning, maybe you get a job and then you're kind of happy, make some money. But halfway through that whole journey, you have to set up your own targets. You have to decide, you're like, it's not so much graduating, it's like, is it job A or B or C or D, or what kind of family life, what are the things that are important to you, what not? And that's actually incredibly hard. And that's also something that isn't being talked a lot, and especially in creative business, especially today too, where we don't really believe in the specialist anymore, and everyone does like 100 things at once, right? It's to really sort of to really set that goal and say, I want to go towards that, or I think that at times can be hard. Also knowing the uncertainty of these times. There's power in that once one is, let's say, comfortable with some of that, but and that can be really liberating. I mean, for me, I still feel, and that's why the comment too with studying in Romanian, not having been to a museum till I was 19, I'm still very much a toddler. So I still navigate the world like a student and bright eyes, and but I'm doing it because I can, meaning because I have my risk aversion kind of works well with that. So what I can tolerate, that I will still sort of pursue this pushing the limits of what I can get away with. I think partially because I didn't grow up in a place where any of that would have been possible. I always say, I don't think we grow up with dreams in Romania. I mean, that sounds dark in the American context. I don't mean it that way. You just kind of live. Like, you don't have this idea of a career and of goals, and like that just wasn't a thing. And sort of just, I'm just learning again how to take that thing outside and let it live outside, and how much can I push my own limits in that and my own comfort zone, and sort of, yeah, just become, I don't know what, actually, better at it, right? Or like just finding that joy in it. And I think maybe the other thing that I learned in these years is the difference between early on the product, the end result was really everything. And in architecture, spend 90-something% of the time on the process. So really valuing the process, really valuing the conversation, the people, because you can easily end up in the wrong environments. Like, I've seen people being stuck in architecture offices. They hate, but because it's a big name, they end up thinking, I need to beat myself up because this is how I want to succeed at this. But the only thing is, it's not like they're bad at it, they're just in the wrong office. And architecture, like many forms of art, can be done in many different ways. There's not singular way of doing it. So when we encounter a singular way and we don't fit in, we tend to internalize it quite easily. But understanding that it's actually, this is just the wrong crowd. And finding one's family, one community, one crowd, I think that's always, that's been kind of that pursuit. But it was a very, very long, I mean, it seems so obvious maybe, but for me it was a very long learning curve. Because for ages I was also just always on visa. I think I worked 15 years straight because you could never be anywhere except for, like, I don't know, 10, whatever, vacation, right? Because you're always on visa and you always have to earn income and someone has to vouch on it. And like, I fully understand the debilitating nature of being an immigrant. I mean, still am an immigrant in that sense. So that adds to the many stress factors.
Thank you so much. I feel like I have a direction to look into, at least. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks so much, Oana.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all, for being here. Join us next month, and we'll have Benji B here in the social sculpture. check our website for tickets. The exhibition is open until 6 p.m. tonight and through January. So definitely come back for more figures of speech. And thanks so much. Have a great Sunday.